I welcome you all to the plenary lecture of this fifth session of the Institute for World Literature. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Franco Moretti, who, as the cliché goes, does not need an introduction, but this time certainly not used as a cliché. Translated into many languages, Moretti has readers in many parts of the world, and I'm one of them, together with many of my Turkish colleagues. I belong to a school that considers the literary text as refracted material, a term I learned from a revered teacher, Herr Levin, who defined the task of the critic as the exploration of the text's angle of refraction from a medium made up of convention, culture, society, style, and biography. In my own research, to correct the angle of refraction, whenever I felt it was going astray, becoming too wide or too narrow, I have turned to Moretti's work, from the Signs Taken for Wonders to the Way of the World, to the Atlas of the European Novel, 5-volume novel on world novel, distant reading, and the bourgeois. So now, Franco Moretti on patterns.
Is that I'm trying to do three things today with this talk. One is just give many of you who may not be familiar with this new branch of criticism a first introduction. I also want to explain why I think, having devoted many of the last years of my intellectual life to this kind of work, why I think it is a promising line of work. And third, I also will have self-critical reflections interspersed in the talk. So it will shift from a descriptive to a euphoric to a critical register. And don't be puzzled, it's by design that this happens. So, digital humanities, computational criticism, I will use the terms interchangeable. They're one of the big novelties of the last 10 or 20 years in literary history, and the biggest novelty within the novelty, the most dramatic one, is probably the size of the archive. We used to say, someone who worked on 19th century novels used to study a couple of hundred novels. Now we can study 2,000, 20,000, tomorrow 200,000. So it's a moment of great euphoria for quantitative literary history. It's like having received a telescope with which you see whole new galaxies. It's also the moment of truth. Okay, so you now have the telescope, you see these new galaxies. Is there anything that you have seen that should make us change the way in which we think about literature? This is not a rhetorical question to which I will answer, yes, it is a great novelty, not at all. It is a real question, and I will try to explain why it's real by beginning with the essay which is the inspiration, really, for quantitative literary history and quantitative history in general. Is Fernand Brauddel's famous 1958 essay on the longue durée, the long duration. And in that essay, in which indeed Braudel salutes the advent of a quantitative history, as he calls it, a new quantitative history that will break with the traditional forms of 19th century historiography, Braudel mentions as typical objects of this new history demographic progressions, the movement of wages, the variations of interest rates, productivity, money supply and demand, and so on. And all of these are clearly quantifiable entities. Just as clearly, they were completely new materials compared to the materials of traditional historiography. legislation, political cabinets, military campaigns, etc., etc. It was the double shift that generated the break with traditional historiography. Not pontification by itself. But in our case, there is no shift in materials. We can study 200,000 novels instead of 200, but they're all still novels. So, where exactly is the novelty? A plausible argument at this point is, come on, 199,000 novels that no one had ever read or studied, how can there not be a novelty in that archive? And intuitively, one sees the point. But another argument for pontification in the humanities, this time from anthropology, complicates what seems otherwise to be so plausible. This time it's an anthropologist, André Leroy-Gorin, in Gesture and Speech, written a few years after Brodel's essay. We know more about people exchanging goods for reasons of prestige than about the kinds of exchanges that go on every day. More about the circulation of dowry money than about the selling of vegetables. Dowry and vegetables is a perfect antithesis for this paradigm shift. Both are very important, but for completely opposite reasons. Dowry is important because it happens once in a lifetime. Vegetables are important because we eat them every day. And it is really a shift from one plane of history to the other. And at first sight, it seems that it aligns extremely well with the 200 novels and the 200,000 novels, right? And the prestige and the forgotten. But if we push the parallel a little farther, a problem immediately emerges. Take two novels published in the same year, fateful year of 1814. One is Walter Scott's Waverley, and the other is James Brewer's Sir Ferdinand of England. You've all heard about one, and none of you has heard, I think, about the other. I certainly haven't. And intuitively, it's easy. One would immediately assign prestige to Waverley and the humble role of vegetables to Sir Ferdinand of England. But actually, Waverley was both the great formal breakthrough and the book that everybody was reading all over Europe. They weren't reading Sir Ferdinand of England, they were reading Waverley. So in a sense, Waverley was both dowry and vegetables rolled into one. But if that is so, then what do the countless Sir Ferdinands that we find in the new archive tell us? We knew nothing about them, now we know something. Knowledge is always good, fine. Is it also knowledge that changes something in the way we conceive of literary history? This is a real question. Not if there is some new knowledge, of course there is some new knowledge. You have these new archives, but is it knowledge that matters? All right, as far as literary history goes, my answer is no, not yet, anyway. There is a lot of refinement of what we already knew, but no paradigm shift. Something, however, has begun to change, if not in the results, in the nature of the work we are doing. In this sense, that when you study 200,000 novels instead of 200, you're not doing the same thing except that it's 1,000 times bigger. Scale changes the kind of work you're doing, changes the relationship to the object, and in fact, it changes the object itself. No one has ever seen the object studied by contemporary historians. This is Christoph Pongen, another of the social historians of the Annals School. No one could ever have seen him because they have no equivalent within lived experience. And he's right. No one has a lived experience of demographic change or of literacy rates. No one has a lived experience of this. Let me just leave this over there for one moment. I'll return to it in a couple of minutes. This is what literature becomes in the new space of the literary lab that use a computational approach. This is our new object of study. We're still studying novels. We prepare them for analysis in a way that completely changes what is in front of our eyes. look at this diagram of metricality, as they call it, created by a group of Stanford graduate students. This is 5 centuries of English poems charted here on the basis of 2 very simple sets of variables. Whether the feet is binary or ternary, and whether the rhythm is ascending or falling. 2 sets of variables, thousands of poems mapped on a single chart. Or look at this other diagram done by my young colleague Mark Algie Hewitt. He has used bigrams. Bigrams are 2 consecutive words, any kind of 2 consecutive words. He has used bigrams to reflect on the relationship between the Waverleys in blue and the Sir Ferdinands of England in red of the 19th century. Has actually found a stunning separation based simply on the presence of bigrams in these texts. Now, and more should be said about these charts, but I'm moving on and to make the next point, which is that they prove Pomian was right, because these are objects with no equivalent in our lived experience of literature. Reading a novel, watching a play, listening to a poem, this is the lived experience of literature. This is how we experience. This is the concrete form in which we... These are abstractions. Total abstractions. And this is indeed the main novelty of the computational approach. Rethinking literature in ways that foreground those traits that can be abstracted, operationalized, as the jargon has it, and in short, programmed. No new materials, yet not even more ordinary versions of the old materials, but a new way to study literary materials. So perhaps the most dramatic novelty of the digital approach is not so much the archive, it is the algorithm that allow us to transform literature into these abstractions, to analyze it through them. And, abstractions that, as a rule, have a very strong affinity with the extremes of the literary scale. 2 words, a century of novels. Very small, very large, much too small or too large for our lived experience of literature. It's like, micromegas, really. It's something that goes beyond our processing power. And this is why the break with tradition. It's not an accident that traditional literary study used, always focused not on the extremes of the scale, right, like here, but on the middle of the scale. On a text, on a scene, on a poem, on an excerpt, on a bundle of verses, whatever it is, a scale which is an anthropocentric scale, which is a concrete scale, a scale in which readers are the measure of things. Here, readers are nothing. Nothing. You can't read this. You can't read bigrams. We tried to read bigrams. You can't. So, just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should stop reading books. I have to say this because it has been bounced against me so many times. I'm not saying we should stop reading books. Reading is one of the great pleasures of life, one of the greatest pleasures of life. It would be crazy to give it up. What is at stake is not reading, it's the continuity between reading and knowledge. I read books. When I work in the literary lab, books are not the basis of my work. Corpora are. Ideally, a corpus of those 200,000 words. And this is an enormous change from text to corpora, because as corpus linguistics has taught us, a corpus is not just like a text, only more of it. Texts are communicative events. People write them in specific contexts in order to convey a given meaning. No one writes corpora. They're not communicative events. They are totally abstract creations put together by the analyst in order to pursue a certain type of research. A sample of the language gathered for linguistic analysis. That is the standard corpus linguistics definition. Or in other words, corpora don't speak to us. they have nothing to say to us. They have no meaning, really, in the ordinary sense of this word. Now, meaning is not one of the things literary critics study. It is the thing literary critics study. Here lies the great challenge of computational criticism. Here we are, a way to study literature, pushing meaning to the side of the picture. But this, of course, is also the great challenge for computational criticism. Okay, you push meaning to the side of the picture, and you replace it with what? You have to replace it with something. So, in order to sort of try and provide an answer, I'll return to the first chart that I showed, which was, the first, I will return, don't worry, that chart will return and return and return and return. So that was a chart which was part of a study we've published already, which had to do with the stylistics of the sentence. And in the study, at a certain point, we were comparing sentences formed by two clauses, in which, in one case, the independent clause came first and the dependent clause followed. I opened the door as soon as the doorbell rang. And in the other case, the dependent clause came first and the independent followed. As soon as the bell rang, I opened the door. And, in my examples, the content of the sentences doesn't change when the sequence is inversed. But we suspected that actually in the actual praxis of writing, this syntactic position may impact semantic content. And in order to test this hypothesis, we had to break down those sentences a little further. So we created 4 distinct classes of clauses. You can see the first one is the independent clause of a sentence in which the independent clause comes first and the dependent clause follows. The second is the dependent clause of that same sequence, etc., etc. And as you can immediately see from this example, which is not even very complex, in fact it's not complex at all, there is a part, much of the hype of computer culture in general and digital humanities in particular is, how incredibly interesting this is. Actually, the amount of tedium and boredom and drudgery that goes into all of these studies is astonishing. I've never been so bored as I have since I've started. So bored in a certain phase. It's not all there is, but certainly there is because it becomes absolutely mechanical, very technical, very arid, dry, and you just have no idea when you will return to the real world. Eventually, we created these 4 distinct clauses. Then we calculated, in ways I can explain later, the words that were most distinctive of the 4 clauses. And then we used principal component analysis, which is a technique of analysis and visualization, which I also can explain later, to visualize the result. And this is the result. This is the chart from which I started. And the 4 clauses are in red, and they are very well separated, and they're surrounded by the words that are most often associated with them, that are most distinctive of them. And the color of the words indicates their occurrences, the size of the words indicates their distinctiveness. There is a lot of information in this chart, and it shows, because the separation is so good, that syntax and semantics are indeed correlated. The point is, how exactly are they correlated? You create this new object of study. Well, and how do you study it? How does one proceed in this jungle of print? What do you do with this? Second, sort of ironical reflection on digital humanities again. The emphasis on speed in this field is so frequent, but actually patience is the main virtue of a digital humanist, because you have to sit in front of this jungle of print for hours and hours, and then eventually, slowly, usually, not always, something emerges. In the upper right quadrant of this image, for instance, near the dependent clause of the dependent-independent sequence, a cluster of terms emerged which had a clear spatial component. Gate, door, road, town, room, house, hall, church, building, etc., etc. Symmetrically, around the around the independent close of the same sequence, a different cluster of terms emerged, and this time it had to do with emotions. Jealousy, feelings, indignation, despair, admiration, fancy, etc., etc., etc. So, two types of clauses, each with a semantic dominant. From what looked like that wall of print, that sort of jungle, that continuum with no hope, a pattern had emerged. Computational criticism dislodges meaning from its central position and replaces it with what? I asked a minute ago. With patterns. Now, before saying more on patterns, brief parenthesis. This is not the right occasion for, to spend half an hour on this image. But I want to say that if this is indeed our new object of study, this is what we are trying to turn literature into when we approach it computationally, then we should also learn to really see and study it. To see and study it in the same way, or at least not in the same way, but in a comparable way, as we see and study a page in a novel or a scene in a play. And instead, this is, well, for instance, what does it mean that the pattern is so unbalanced, that the one on the left is so much more distant from the center of the image, and being distant means also that it is more distinctive of it. Why are three, oh shoot. Well, I will return to this later if you want. No, in fact, I would return to this right now because you have to see it. Why are three of the clauses so well differentiated, whereas the fourth one lies near the middle of the image? And by lying near the middle of the image, it means that its typical words are also typical to a large extent of the other three clauses. In other words, it's not differentiated at all. Why three are differentiated and the fourth one is not? And so on and so on. Other questions can be asked of a chart like this. But this is not what digital humanities usually does. Some of you may have sat through some digital humanities talks. Charts are projected, many charts are made, very little time is spent actually analyzing the chart. And that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake that arises from the fact that the field has not yet completely accepted, completely realized the entity of the shift towards abstraction. We haven't yet completely, or at least many of us, have not yet completely accepted all the consequences of these terms. It's as if people were still a little embarrassed by these charts. But the truth is that if computational criticism has something to add to literary history, if it can make a difference, it will be through abstraction, and in fact even through more abstraction than this. Not through the polite pretense that we do these things, but then, we really don't care. Okay, close the parenthesis on the relationship to the new object of study, and let me turn back to patterns, which are this great keyword of our times, as you know. The question is, what exactly does pattern mean as a term? Certainly not what it meant at the beginning of its history. It came into English from the French patron, and it used to indicate something shaped or designed to serve as a model from which a thing is to be made, an example or a model to be imitated, an instance, especially one taken as typical. And it's actually only recently, about a century ago, that the term makes a radical shift from the normative, the model to be imitated, to the empirical, and becomes a regular and intelligible form or sequence, or an arrangement of relationships of elements. And it was only after this shift, incidentally, that pattern suddenly increases its presence in the English language. As you can see, until the early 20th century, it's remained stable at a very low presence, and then it increases about 5 times, more or less. All right, so a relationship of elements, a relationship like that between words and clauses that I was showing a minute ago, a correlation. 7 years ago, in 2008, the man who was then the editor of Wired magazine, which is one of the organs of the Pravdas of the digital world, Chris Anderson, used the notion of correlation to announce the end of science. The article was entitled The End of Science. Scientists are trained to recognize that correlation is not causation, that you must understand the underlying mechanism, the model that connects the two. But faced with massive data, this approach to science is becoming obsolete. Petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. Correlation supersedes causation, and science can advance even without coherent models, without unified theories, or really without any mechanistic explanation at all. Now, I find this a fascinating statement because it expresses with absolute candor the profound ambivalence towards knowledge that is typical of our times. Correlations? Yes. No theories, no models, not even explanations. It's really a form of anti-intellectualism, and it's the same form of anti-intellectualism, and for a reason, as that unleashed by the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. One needs knowledge for machines to work, but only that knowledge. Useful knowledge, as the Victorians called it. Engineers, not scientists. Exactly the same in Silicon Valley today, where, incidentally, Chris Anderson has meanwhile successfully retooled itself, as the saying goes, as a drone manufacturer. So, what is one to do with patterns if one thinks that correlations are not enough, and yet has spent a lot of time looking for these patterns? Well, one possibility is to take them not as a conclusion, which is usually the case in digital humanities research, but as an intermediate result. Patterns as a mediation and as sort of a bridge connecting two very different domains. The first domain is an empirical one. It's the domain of data. It's the domain of distributions. It's this carpet of words which are so much larger, so much less orderly than patterns are. The second domain is completely different. It's a conceptual one. It's the world of forms, like the space-emotion polarity that can be abstracted from the chart, and that is so much smaller and so much more orderly than any pattern will ever be. And the miracle of patterns, the reason why they're so important, the miracle of patterns is to make form visible within distributions, to make concepts somehow continuous with empirical data. This is why one looks for patterns, because they can create this bridge between two domains that are otherwise categorically heterogeneous to each other. Now, this interplay between distributions, patterns, and forms is complicated, as you may imagine. It's also the key to much of the work, and I think to all the best work that we do at the Literary Lab at Stanford. So I will try to be, in this conclusion, as clear as possible about it. And the first thing to say, it's a matter of causation, to understand, what is going on here. Because in my presentation, I said that the pattern emerged from the data of the distribution, and then that the formal structure itself was abstracted from the pattern. And this is indeed how we perceive the whole process. But it's important to understand that what brings the pattern into being in the first place is a process of repetition. It's the fact that door and gate and home keep occurring in dependent clauses, and tears and feelings and indignation keep occurring in independent clauses, and that this process of repetition is itself the product of the formal structure that is on the screen right now. Form is the repeatable element of literature, and the patterns we find in the data, the figure in the carpet, so to speak, these patterns are the product of form. So although in my presentation I proceeded from distribution to patterns and from patterns to form, the actual causal chain proceeds from form to patterns, not vice versa. In a sense, a pattern is just the shadow that a form throws over a world of data. Second point that deserves to be made is that this conjunction of space and emotions had nothing inevitable about it. There is no obvious logic to the conjunction. There was nothing inherently plausible about it, so much so that it begins really with a sort of mythical, fairy tale-like conjunction with Gothic novels, where space is absolutely and always sensational, and emotions are always extreme. You have castles and terror, caves and despair. You have dungeons and madness. Occasionally you even have hell and eternal damnation. And it's as implausible a conjunction as it gets. But once the link is in place, for some reason that I'm not sure about, it is refunctionalized, the repeatable element in literature, it is refunctionalized over and over again, and it becomes a cornerstone of 19th century novelistic imagining. First step is historical novels, which have a very clear sense of space in internal national peripheries, and just as clear a sense of emotions. Those peripheries are the asylum for the grand emotions of the past that are doomed to disappear in modern times. Then it's a moment of the metropolis, each of them with its own emotional pathology, London and eccentricity, Paris and melodrama, Petersburg and radicalism, Madrid and folly, and so on. Then is the moment of the provinces, a new space which for the first time brings to life in a novel the new feeling of modern boredom. And at the end of the century, the great naturalist cycles that use space, usually regional space, as in Hardy and Verga, but not necessarily regional, into a figure for tragic fate of modern times. It's really a century of variations on this fundamental formal structure. Now, this was a ridiculously accelerated summary of 19th century novelistic history, of course, but it was there because I wanted to give an idea of how we can reverse the direction of research I've been sketching so far and return from abstraction into literary history. And one can do it, I think, for the very specific, very peculiar grasp that the concept of form allows us to have over historical materials. The way to think about this, I think about this in very much the same way as Max Weber thought about the ideal type. A mental construct like this that cannot be found empirically anywhere in reality. Nowhere in novels you will find anything like this. It cannot be found empirically anywhere in reality, but it can be used for comparison with and measurement of reality. And that's exactly it. That's how we can use form to make sense of history. With one specification. In fact, using formal structure for the measurement of reality is much easier now because of the algorithm, computer algorithm, than it was 100 years ago when Weber wrote his essay on objectivity in social science. With one specification, that such return to literary reality, to repeat Weber's term with which I have no quarrel, I believe there is such a thing as literary reality, it doesn't simply mean, and in fact, it doesn't really mean at all, a return to text, pure and simple. Rather, I think we must learn to see literary reality within the very abstractions that I have been presenting, but this time shifting our focus. What do I mean? Let me return to an earlier point. Distributions are often, usually, chaotic, I said, patterns help us to face the chaos by creating some kind of order, which eventually is strengthened and essentialized in translating the pattern into a formal structure. So the path is from disorder to order. But the fact that patterns mediate between chaotic empirical data and orderly conceptual forms, what I've earlier described as the miracle of patterns, making form visible within distributions, this also inevitably entails that patterns are never perfect. A passage from Spitzer comes to mind. Spitzer's stylistics is one and perhaps the most important theoretical precedent for much of the work we're doing in digital humanities. It's a passage in Linguistics and Literary History in which he writes that it is not by chance that the philological circle, that is to say, the interpretive strategy that works by linking systematically detail and whole and back to detail and back to whole, and which is the foundation of hermeneutics and of stylistics itself, it's not by chance that the philological circle was discovered by a theologian who was wont to harmonize the discordant, to trace the beauty of God in this world. Well, there is no beauty of God in patterns or in computational criticism in general. There is some order, and it's nice that there is some order, but really never that much. Right in the middle of the pattern I was describing, between door and road and town, we find God. And a little farther down we find bishop. And then we find sound and situation and candle and even Carlyle and letter. There is a lot of noise on the bridge between data and concepts. This noise is precisely the literary reality we're trying to return to. So, far from invalidating the findings, because the pattern is real, and there is no other pattern which is better than this in this data. The pattern is real, it's just not perfect. It's porous. But the noise within the pattern does not invalidate it. It just makes the findings valuable in a different way, in the sense that by reinscribing form through the pattern within distributions, patterns make us see form not as a given, but as a process. And in fact, as an unlikely process at that. A small region of order surrounded by a maelstrom of alternative possibilities. Form and historical contingency. This is what this chart shows. All those words, all those other semantic options that were around thousands of times and never crystallized into a recognizable formation. As the digital archive revealed anything that forces us to change our view of literature, I asked at the beginning, well, this. It turns out that there is much more disorder and much more randomness than we expected in literary reality. And again, the disorder is not just an obstacle to knowledge, as in a certain phase it certainly is, but it's not only that. It can itself become an object of knowledge, creating a new historical and conceptual task, which is mapping, to the extent that it's possible, the countless alternatives that make up the literary field. The great many different, discrete, concrete individual phenomena, to quote Weber once again. So, trying to see form and the formless together, integrated into a single conception of literary evolution. Think of this. Goethe, Austen, Balzac, these are easy to explain. They're complex, but they clearly make sense. What doesn't make sense, but at some point, for some people, in some way, did. That's the thing that's hard to explain in literary history. And that is what the new archive and these new methods of visualization have to offer to the renewal of literary and cultural history. So, step by step, a research program is becoming imaginable that isn't yet, but may live out to the great plan outlined a century ago by Darcy Thompson in his masterpiece on growth and form. The form of any portion of matter, whether it be living or dead, may in all cases be described as due to the action of force. In short, the form of an object is a diagram of forces, in this sense at least, that from it we can deduce the forces that have acted upon it. Reverse engineering forms so as to understand the forces which have generated them and the entire morphospace around them. This is a challenge for computational criticism. After having transformed the living experience of literature into abstractions, and having searched the abstractions for patterns and extracted from patterns the formal relationships that underlie and generate them, the last, and for some of us, the most important step, using all of this so as to place the social understanding of literature on a completely new basis. This is not something for today, it's not even for tomorrow, hopefully for some time soon. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk. I find it interesting that at the same historical moment when humanity are trying to get closer to quantitative social sciences, there is sort of a reverse movement in the social sciences of problematizing quantitative methods. And I'm thinking, for example, about Ian Hacking's work, about statistics, about Bruno Latour, about the social construction, right, of scientific facts. And I was wondering, well, I guess it's a methodological question as well as a theoretical one. How do you address these things, if you do, in your work in the lab, with regard to, for example, the categories that you define, what you put in every different category?
Sorry, I think these are two different questions. One is what I think of these studies, like in Hacking's and Latour's, and I think various things. Latour has written many books, and I think of some books very differently from the way I think about other books. I mean, some I really like, others less. Hacking I have a more consistent admiration for. However, they are simply ways of telling you that no starting point in research is objective. I know that. I've always known that. Weber had already said that. So had Marx. I have no delusion. How we form this corpus, how we decided to look only for nouns rather than, say, for adverbs and adjectives. These are all decisions that the researcher takes at the beginning and declares. These are all subjective decisions. Usually, as a matter of fact, you make many of them and then pursue the one that seems more promising, and that there is nothing wrong in doing that. This is a subjective moment. Then what follows, to a large extent, it is objective, not in the sense that it was already there, but in the sense that if you do the same type, ideal, that if you do the same type of research that we have done, you would find the same results. Then, stage 3, what you do with your results, how you explain them, whether you find this pattern or another pattern or no pattern at all. That, again, is an interpretive moment or explanatory moment. So, honestly, I'm not in the least troubled by the fact that my starting point is not objective. I know. What the specific, what else could it be, right? The difference is that some subjective starting points have very short objective runs, so to speak, and this has a long one, and can capture a lot of things. I mean, it's as for what specific categorical choices we make at the end, this really varies from project to project. We often change in the course of the research, and we can discuss some details, but that is, we now are beginning to return to the same types of questions and of techniques, but I don't yet feel strongly about those. I mean, it's just become, it's more of a habit than a conceptual choice.
So one of the challenges we have in the digital humanities club is the temptation to move away from explanatory data to exploratory data. I'm wondering, beyond visualizations, what are other ways we can ask better questions of our textual data?
This is a very good question, and the difference between explanatory and exploratory. In fact, most of the including ours, begins with a desire for exploration. There are all these books that no one has read, and of course you want to find something out about them. Very often explorations, I think it's appropriate to say this given the country we are in, explorations begin a little lackadaisically. You're not sure where you're going to end up. And so that is a different mode from the maturely scientific one. But there's nothing wrong. It's the beginning of a field. It's a completely new archive. It's a completely new continent. There should be explorations. There should be mess. Explanations is a different story. They have to follow rules of logic, and again, it changes depending what you're trying to explain. If you're trying to explain a historical trend, you need a certain type of explanation. If you're trying to explain a structure, you need a different type of explanation. Causal explanation play a stronger or weaker role, functional explanation the same, etc., etc. The two modalities, in my opinion, exploration, explanation, are independent of each other. They're just two activities that should be pursued. Ideally, the age of exploration comes to an end and the age of explanation begins. In fact, they begin together, and I like explanations better if I have to give a value judgment. I find them intellectually more satisfying.
Thank you. Wonderfully interesting and illuminating. I'd love to hear more about the operations that were performed on all the words there in order to get where you get with them. You, as part of the noise, pointed to Carlyle. I wonder what kind of corpus it can be that Carlyle appears so often, or what. Beyond that, though, I wonder, tell me if you can just say what I'm about to propose is not interesting, and we'll walk away from it. But it seems to me that an analysis that's open to a lot of noise but wants some meaning too is going to be very different from a circa 1965 structuralist analysis that would have wanted to configure all of the terms as part of the pattern. And so we know famous structuralist analyses of various types for which one against many, 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 many is crucial to defining the structure, or even zero versus many, many, many. So,
yeah. Good question. I am disappointed because I don't know what Carlyle is doing there. This is part of future work. We were concentrating on order, not yet on disorder, and he was actually only preparing this.
Heroes is there too. This is a pure principle of order that.
Well, the point is this, right? And so are God and Bishop. So there are possible alternative patterns. This is simply the strongest one, and this is everybody's looking for patterns. But this is again phase 3. This data, ideally, anyone ends up with the same image, and I will explain in a moment how it's done. What to make of the data? This is what we make. Someone makes something else, someone makes something else, and then, as in every interpretive struggle, you weigh the evidence and decide what is more persuasive. In that respect, there is nothing different. It's the same exercise performed on a different object. The objects are the same. How do we get here? Well, basically, how do you establish what words are distinctive of each class? It's a rather simple statistical operation. Say that you have recorded all talks that have happened in this room, during this session, and a word pattern is uttered 100 times in 5 talks that have occurred here. So on average, 20 times. But today, it's actually uttered 97 times. So pattern, it's really, the distinctiveness is the ratio between what you expect in terms of frequency and what you actually have. And this means, incidentally, that, and then these frequencies, both the positive frequencies, how often Hall and Carlyle and Campbell happen, and how rarely Duchess and Dress occur in those type of sequences, generate the image. So it's really an image that tells you, that's how the various positive and negative correlations are put together in a string, etc., etc. It's a long and tedious explanation. This is an approximation. The same data that I always start by analyzing through visualizations also come in tables of words with their frequencies, with their statistical value of significance, etc., etc. Now, the other question that you had, which was
interpretation of pattern versus structuralism.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, structuralism did not have the data. It's really as simple as that. It never measured its structures against actual distributions. In the euphoric moments, what I think we are trying to do here is to give an empirical foundation, not exactly to structuralism as it was in 1965, but to a form of that. And in a sense, it has to be that way because usually in order to count, you must first define. And having to do with literature, we usually tend to define units formally. So the starting point tends to be formal, even though then you can fill the formal category with semantics, whatever you want. So in a sense, it's an empirical testing of a structural or a formalist approach.
But as opposed to at least certain major lines of structuralism, it doesn't deal with absence.
No. Well, it doesn't deal with absence. It deals actually, when I said how seldom Duchess and Dress appear in clauses of that type, that is a form of absence. It doesn't deal with absolute absence, but really, there is no such thing as absolute absence, right? It's really relative absence. Once you get to a corpus of millions of words, I mean, rarity is more significant as a term than absence, I think. But no, negative presence is visible here, and actually it's important because it's one thing if absence is God. Okay, there is the absence of, but actually the absence of Dress and Duchess and Shoulder and Servant, you don't get that. When we read, we see what we see, but we do not see what we don't see. And these charts make it visible. Today I've focused on the presence, but one could reverse, and in fact, once we did, and look at what is not there, as just as important to define what is there.
I found the discussion of the method fascinating. It's all new to me, so I need some more time to draw on that. I was wondering if you could just comment on, are there any, you were almost touching on it there, have there been any particular words that you've thought that's a really weird place on my graphic representation for it to turn up? Can you, have you drawn any conclusions like that, or has anything really perplexed you yet in your research?
No, every now and then we do, okay. You start on a quantitative approach to literature. And you want to prove that there is some merit to it, right? So you have to find something new. Is that the whole story? Shouldn't the method, to begin with, find what was already known? Say, in applying network theory to drama, network theory has a criterion of centrality. I did networks of Hamlet, and when I published the result, I had a half sentence that said, the center of the network is Hamlet, but what is really interesting, etc., etc. Of course, hostile reviews focus on that. Oh, this guy did all this work and discovered that the center of Hamlet is Hamlet. Wow! The point is that the hostile critic misses is, had I not found that Hamlet was the center of the network, then that would, in my mind, have invalidated it. It would have been too crazy a novelty. So, this is a bit of tightrope walking. These methods should simultaneously find what you think should be solidly expected, and then complicate it, if possible, change it. But you know, it's a balancing act whose logic I haven't yet completely figured out. But I know that you know it's there. That said, have we found results that surprised us? Actually, yes. In this case, you know, we found this lovely little pattern, and so in that study 2 years ago, one of the following steps was, okay, program, recall all the sentences in which the first, the dependent clause, the initial dependent clause has one of those spatial terms, and the following independent clause has one of those emotional. So let's look at them and see, you know, and it turns out that many of them were actually rather awful sentences, and which in fact strengthens the point of how curious it is to put space and emotions together. So curious that most writers, and even great writers quite often, don't know how to do it well. When they do it well, it's great. Because these are such crucial concepts, you know, realistic milieu and melodrama for 19th century novel. I mean, it's really fantastic that they can. So this was a surprise. I mean, you have this. We figured we'd find, you know, hundreds of sentences. No, what the sentences told us was that the construction was indeed always an effort at the level of the sentence. Then at the level of the narrative as a whole, of course, things are different. At the level of the sentence, minor surprise. There are others, but you know, every time it would be a little lengthy. I'd be happy to do it in person, but you know, because I would have to explain the experiment, the result, and
I'm curious if you could talk a bit about if you could apply a chart like this to your lab and the working method. If one term was graduate student, one was Moretti, one was assistant professor, how would you graph how projects and concepts evolve?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I must say, it's not that the temptation to apply these methods to our own work has not occurred. It's just that we're trying to resist, you know, the sirens of narcissism. So we haven't, I don't know. What I can say is that this was collective work, and I was the only faculty with 5 grad students. Well, one of them at that point was a postdoc, maybe another one, maybe 2 of them were postdocs, but that was me and 5 grad students. So most of the work, this paper today, no, it's largely my own concoction, but almost everything is collective work. And you see, the advantage of something like this is that, of course, the more you know, the more you can read. But the data are really the same for everyone. Yeah? It's not exactly the same as putting a poem on the table and have a whole class discuss it in the typical American seminar initial gambit. But it is beginning to resemble it. I mean, it's, you know, to create a situation of equality. And in fact, there is something else. It's not just a situation of equality, it's that to crack this kind of stuff, a single person usually can't do it. I mean, there is the most important tool in research, in this type of research, is really the conference. Someone has the idea, someone cleans the corpus, someone generates the algorithm, we find the data, we put them on the bill, and then you start discussing it. And to make sense of the noise, you need a sort of relay waves between different people. I mean, and each one takes it to a certain, the group is crucial not only because of the division of labor, which is important, but also because then the division of labor stops and everybody becomes an observer in the same way, except that everybody sees something different. And so, you know, in the good scenario, a product emerges. The essay from which these were drawn could not have been written by any individual, including myself, for sure. And again, not just because of technical competences, but also for in the process of discovery.
Thank you very much, Franco. I'm still waiting for the third part, the post-euphoric critique of your endeavor, of self-critique. And, well, maybe I'll stop there, but I have a subsequent question. I was wondering whether you might be familiar with William Gibson's novel, Pattern Recognition.
Alas, yes. I've tried to read it 10 times. So that's the answer for pattern recognition. I find it unbearable. It would be so useful to have that note, but I just can't go on. As for no self-critique, well, I don't know. I thought, there were a lot of moments. Look, usually the claims for digital humanities, this is, it feels like the end of the Zauberflöte, the rays of the sun are dispersed in the night, we do nothing, now we find. No, actually, it's not clear what we've changed in literary history, it's not clear what we've changed, if any, in literary theory. There is no single result that I would say, but come on, we found this, and you still deny it? No, there isn't a single result which has yet that power. So, we found a lot of interesting stuff, but a lot of interesting stuff it's what Schumpeter said of coaches. You can put, coaches, as many coaches as you want, one after the other. To make a train, you need the steam engine. And we haven't found this. I mean, we have the steam engine in the algorithm. We haven't found anything yet. More self-critical than that. I mean, a new paradigm and say, well, but this new paradigm is not really a paradigm yet. That's not changed. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for your fascinating talk, and it's just a short question, in fact. My question concerns your mentioning of structuralism and formalism. And when you started talking about the way in which different clauses could be sorted, I had to think of Jacobson and his poetic function, saying that the way we order names when we address different people, for example, was simply due to our perception of the poetic function of language. And my question to you would be in how far you see your task in, systematizing the poetic function of language at a specific point in time.
The poetic function as defined by Jacobson has never yet, at least, entered our work. But this is just a fact, it's not a decision. I mean, no one with that kind of interest has so far led one of these projects. So, but otherwise, 90% of our categorical apparatus comes from linguistics and from Russian foreigners. So, if anything, this is, and this explains why, you thought of structuralism. This is largely a return to the formalist, perhaps more than the structuralist, approach to literature within a new system. So we've been working with several of those categories, just not with that. Even the study of poetry has to do with meter and only with meter. Or at least so far. I'm not involved in it, but I know that so far it only has to do with that. But this is just, let's not be delusional here. This is a dozen people in a room which is as big as that screen. So with very few resources, etc., there is a limit to what we can do, and we would like to do much more. There are very strong limits to what we can do. Yeah, someone, David, you have to decide who told, because I cannot do this. Yes.
That was largely my question.
Yeah.
You presented this as something very new, like new fields opening up, and from my very naive perspective, it looks a lot like descriptive linguistics. And so I was just wondering to what degree you concur that it is an extension of descriptive linguistics, and to what degree you would separate it as a fundamentally different project from that.
Yeah, I made it very clear from the beginning that corpus linguistics offer the basis for the construction of the corpus and for the approach to the corpus. In this case, perhaps because I had in mind this, I wanted to discuss this concept of pattern that for me is very important, even though perhaps it's not as important for everybody, because not everybody seems to be as taken by the idea as I am. So I focus on a very abstract example in which linguistics played a particularly evident role. That same article, actually, the article from which all these illustrations are taken, has to do with the emergence of style, and that is not a problem of descriptive linguistics. It actually, the whole point of the article was how from elements that are perfectly described by linguistics, a combination emerges for which you need concepts that linguistics does not offer. So, but that the foundation is linguistics whenever we study language. And honestly, what else could it be, or should it be? I think this was a crazy, suicidal decision that English departments in the United States took in the course of the 1980s to cut any relationship with linguistics departments. It was insane. And, but, it happened, and at this point, it's a fact of life. I'm sure at Stanford we are the ones who have greatest comments with people in linguistics. No one else does. But I think that's, it's not particularly virtuous on our part. It's just when you start taking language seriously, and this forces you to take language seriously, because you need categories in order to operationalize in the new country.
Hi. I'm, of course, still trying to wrap my head around this, but I wanted to ask, speaking of world literature and speaking of linguistical exchanges, if there is a way in which these methods can be used to grasp or to formalize difference and radical difference. What do we do if we want to look at corpuses that have, two languages, one of which does not have nouns or does not have? So how do we look at radical cultural difference? How do we even see it? Can it be plotted out?
No, excellent question. As I said, a very unwelcome development of digital humanities is that you have these fantastic new methods, and they have re-provincialized the study of literature. So the digital humanities in the States is virtually 100% on English texts. Why? Because the linguistic basis, the linguistic parsers that get to work on this need consistency in language. And especially so if they become grammatical parsers. So if you're not just interested in words, but say in adjectives and verbs, and especially so if they're syntactical parsers, when you actually want to see the structure of sentences. So the immediate step, leaving radical different, languages that don't have nouns aside for a moment. The first step we're taking, it's actually a study that's been conducted, it's taking very similar corpora of nationalist novels from English, French, Italian, and American literature and study them in translation. Because we see no alternative to doing that. This is starting as I speak, so we don't really have results yet. The idea is we get results based on translation. Then we run a second test on French and Italian texts to see if the results are indeed corroborated or if they are an effect of translation. Either way, it's interesting. Perhaps even more if it is an effect of translation. But, it's a very slow. This clearly will make everything much slower. And or you can have, of course, parallel teams that work on the same issue. For instance, we are doing a study of canon and archive in 19th century English literature. There is a French group that supposedly is beginning to work on canon and archive in 19th century French literature. And then you see. So this kind of sense, very works. What is lovely about comparative literature and even more about word literature is the bold synthetic sweep of a concept that can take no, this doesn't happen here. This is tedious work. No question.
Hi, I'm interested in how this particular approach might be applied to a form like poetry. More specifically, something as seemingly intangible as a line break. So how would you, given two very distinct practitioners with varying line lengths, such as Walt Whitman on the one hand and Emily Dickinson on the other hand, how would you approach the question of lineation from the perspective or the approach of corpus linguistics?
I'm sorry, I have no idea. I really don't know. It takes a lot of preparation to start one of these projects. It's not, that's the only answer I can give. I don't know. Someone who's interested, I'm not interested in that specific question. Someone who's interested in that would have an idea how to operationalize. I don't. See, the starting point here, you have to start from rather clearly defined concepts in order to find any. And I don't know about others, I certainly do not have clearly defined concepts about everything in literature. Just very few things. And those I do, and the rest someone else has to do. It's three of us over there at the lab. Come on, someone else. Get up and do it.
You underlined the anthropological promises of your project, namely the fact that it would enable us to reach a new social understanding of literature. Well, I can understand the polemical relevance of such a new understanding for literary research, for academic research. As it was, as we all know, long indebted to possibly impressionist qualitative approaches. However, I wanted to ask you if and how do you see the impact of such a project at the more basic level of teaching literature, as this more basic level has, or it still is traditionally based on transmission of values and of representations, transmission of aesthetic values and so on.
Okay, there are two questions here, I think, at least two. One has to do with how this can be used in teaching literature, And the second is, what is the relationship between this and the transmission of values? Not all teaching of literature is transmission of values, and not all of it has been that. The examples, the models that I personally have, neither the formalists nor the Marxists have been particularly keen on using it as transmission of values. So, in that respect, I think that this has zero value for the transmission of values, and I'm fine with that. As for the teaching, that's a different story. It should become part of teaching, and it already has become. When I was a student, I don't think that in 4 years that I studied literature at university, I read a single critical book, text of literary criticism, which had an image, a painting. Nowadays, it would be hard to find a critical text that does not have a painting. They have few because publishers don't want to spend money to print it, but otherwise, it has become, at a certain point, all of a sudden, literary critics could use paintings to make a literary argument. I think that they didn't turn into art critics, but a certain amount of visual evidence became part of the literary argument. I would imagine that a certain amount of this type of evidence could become part of literary evidence as well. And just, some historical trends, some functional charts, some frequency distribution, some networks, something like this. Maybe I'm wrong. That's certainly how I use it in teaching. It's usually, there are moments in which this comes in handy and other moments in which it doesn't. There is a broader problem, if you wish. Do the students who take literature at the university rejoice when they are, if that was in your mind, well, they should. They should. It is part of modern culture. They should learn this. They should turn into programmers. I can't program. But there is nothing wrong. Musil had a wonderful aphorism on this. Two wonderful aphorisms. One was, we do not have too much precision and too little soul. We have too little precision in matters of the soul. And I think that's absolutely right. And if this could correct and give us a little more precision in matters of the soul, that would be a great result. And you define the soul as that thing that runs away when it hears the words non-linear equation.
My question is about a sort of criticism to this computational method, and I think one of the most interesting arguments is that the work that lies behind and before the explanatory moment is something that typically a traditional humanist could not replicate and could not understand. So my question is what you think of this, and if this is related to the importance of collaboration between humanists and scientists, and if you see this as an impediment to a sort of humanist scholarly work.
When you say the world that lies behind this approach is something that we do not understand, do you mean that, for instance, I do not understand the language of programming?
Particularly of programming algorithms.
Absolutely. I think that to do work in this field, as I said, I cannot program. I try, but I didn't try very hard. I cannot program. What seems to me to be at stake, and we've often discussed this in the lab, is not the fact that everybody should be able to program. It's that the person who doesn't program should understand not the details of the program, but at least the aim of the program. I do not know how to create a program that tells me what words are most distinctive of a certain clause. But actually, I'm the one who came up with the idea and said, look guys, if we want to understand how these clauses work, we must find a way to find out what words cluster around them, because they will give us an idea, an initial idea of what we are looking for. And then someone else knew how to write the algorithm. And I knew, the relevance of the outcome. So it's, in a sense, you don't have to know the details, but you have to know the rationale behind it. And it's not a big problem, really, viewed in that sense. It's not a big problem. It does not mean for us. That's pretty clear.
I'm very honored to have a chance to have a final question. I'm not finalizing it, but my question is actually the tangential points of all the cross-check spirit. And also, I've been thinking about the noise and silence everywhere, and the form and formlessness, and a kind of specialized in poetry. And then when I listen to your language and your pattern of everything, it's kind of the pattern itself comes from the formlessness of this silence, first of all, and then developed into formalized in a kind of certain pattern in a very distinctive way because of language, the nature of language. At first you don't have any intention, but I mean, as you go down, you just go on, you can find something go from your, you didn't have intention, but then suddenly you have reached some kind of purpose. Eventually you are reaching the goal or something. So I think maybe the digital humanities is, we don't know what we are doing, but eventually, after a long process of maybe historical approach to the language and text and everything, at the same time, you visualize something. So I just wonder, why in the center, that spirit of mind, body and mind and spirit comes together? The basic question, but I mean, all this happening of patterns, without the body, then the pattern will not be formalized. So I just wonder, what you're thinking about all this, the galaxy comes from the smallest minute detail. At the same time, we don't know why we are studying the detail, but eventually we are lost somewhere in space and emptiness. But I'm not sure.
This is a feeling one often has in working on these matters, that you're just overwhelmed by what you see, and especially by, at least by the lack of order in what you see, and by the fact that you have to establish order on a scale that goes often beyond your whatever immediate intuitive powers. But I don't want, there are people who talk about the digital sublime and so on. I feel that this computational approach is a fantastic opportunity to turn literary criticism into a rather calm passion, where you have to justify your choices, you have to proceed step by step. So then it's nice to have the occasional crazy metaphor and crazy idea. In fact, the more the better, but there is that discipline. Keynes, at a certain point, had a wonderful sentence about economists. He said, I would like in the future for economists to be recognized as a humble, reliable profession on a par with dentists. I have the same ambition for literary critics. I mean, that we could have, and this, to me, is a great opportunity to do that. And maybe also to do other things, but the dentist is the what I would like.